Welcome to an introduction to accounting, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors. You can find us on Facebook. Just look for Parkbench Tutors. In this short podcast, we're going to introduce you to the idea of the control of inventory, which is a part of cost accounting. So what do we mean by control of inventory? Well, essentially it's having the right amount in the right place at the right time. You may find, if you've got a rather old textbook, that inventory is sometimes called stock. This can be rather confusing because we normally think of stock as being something that is traded on a market. However, we will be using the term inventory. What are the advantages, first of all, of having lots of inventory? Whether you are producing something or whether you're buying something to resell it, right, the rates can vary, the price can vary, and so if you've got inventory, it helps allow for that fluctuation. Similarly, if you've got a production line, then running out of inventory could cause some delays. If you're in the automotive industry, you need an almost continuous supply of components in order to put the vehicles together. If you buy in bulk, you can take advantage of discounts, and you can also take advantage of price fluctuations. If you're just about to start a new assembly line, then it may be advisable to build up inventory before you start off on your production. There are some businesses where it becomes almost essential to hold quite a large amount of inventory. For example, wineries may well hold inventory until the wine is matured, and distilleries, of course, will hold things like whiskies for many years before they're considered mature and ready to sell. Even a farmer picking fruit may well store it once the season is over and store it at a low temperature so it can then be sold during the winter. A timber merchant may fell a section of forest during the summer and may sell that over the winter period as well. So in all these examples, it's usually because there's a crop of some sort involved and the harvesting of the crop takes place at a particular time. In the case of the winery, of course, the crop is grapes. So that's control of inventory. Let's go back now and think about the disadvantage of having large amounts of inventory. Well, it means you tie up capital, and there are better uses for capital. It also means, if it's something for resale, particularly if it's technical equipment such as computers, that in the time you've got it in inventory, it may well become obsolete, or better models may come out and your product may not be so popular. Similarly, although prices can rise, prices can also fall. So in fact, holding in inventory at a time when prices fall doesn't help at all, and discounts may well be lost. There's also a risk of damage from flooding and from theft, and of course you've got to have somewhere to store inventory, and the cost of maintaining the premises for storage can be quite high. That space might be better used for something else. Let's consider just the cost of inventory. When we order something, there are costs associated with purchasing. We go through a series of procedures: purchase order, requisitions, orders, goods received, invoice received, payment, and so on. So there are costs associated with the order. And similarly with transport costs, you've got to get the purchase to you, and you will probably be paying for transport. If you have to move goods around internally between departments or perhaps even between factories, you will also incur transport costs. So holding on to inventory and ordering inventory does bring costs in itself, and some of those costs can't be avoided. Inventory can be held obviously as part of an assembly line, and if you set up an assembly line so that you do a run or a batch, you produce say 5,000 at a time, well, in order to have that run you've got to hold that amount of inventory in the first place. So you have to consider the setup costs, and obviously if it's a large setup cost, then you probably want to run quite a large batch. If it's a small setup cost, then it doesn't really matter if you're producing things in small batches, and so you don't need to hold as much inventory. So that's the idea of how much inventory do you need, when we need it. Let's think about that when for a bit more. there's a time gap between when someone says that they want an item of inventory and ordering it and delivering it, and obviously the smaller that time gap the better. The time gap is referred to as the lead time, right? The lead time, the time between someone saying that they need something ordered and that item actually arriving in inventory. So, how much do we order? Well, we need to know how much is used, and we need to know obviously how much is used in a given time period. And if we do that, then we can determine the ideal reorder level and the reorder quantity. Reorder level means the level below which we shouldn't let inventory fall. So once the inventory reaches that level, then we should order some more. And then of course the reorder quantity is how much we order. Most accounting software, by the way, is set up to generate orders when inventory falls below the reorder level. So if you look at something like Sage line 50 for any item, you can see that it has space there which I've circled for you for reorder levels and reorder quantities. So how do we know how much to order then, and what is our minimum level? Here's one way of doing it. Astro widgets take 7 working days for delivery after you place an order, so that's the lead time, 7 days, and the maximum usage is 250 per day. So how many am I going to be using? How many Astro widgets would be used whilst waiting for the next order to be delivered? And the answer would be 7 times 250. So that comes to 1750. So the reorder level would be 1750. Once the level of Astro widgets falls to 1750 or below, we need to order some more. Now, how many do we order? Well, that's a slightly different situation. You have to realize that depends on a number of factors. We've mentioned the cost of holding inventory, how swiftly they're using, what the discounts are, what the potential damages are, what the space available is, how much capital is tied up, price fluctuations, and so on. So there's no real simple answer to that. In spite of that, you will find in some texts a series of mathematical models which talk about the economic order quantity. That calculation is okay if you're using something at a constant rate and the lead time is constant, and if the price doesn't fluctuate. So there's a calculation for you. The root of 2 times the order cost multiplied by the annual usage divided by the annual holding cost per unit. However, in most components you find that in fact that it's rather more complicated than that. So, inventory control. There are 2 commonly used methods. The reorder level, which we've just mentioned, which is built into most accounting software, and then periodic review, which means we review something at fixed points in time. If, for example, you review something at the end of each month, you look at all your components and take the numbers in inventory, then obviously it's got an advantage that's quite easy to organize. You do an inventory check once a month. The disadvantage, of course, is if you run out of something before the end of the month, then you're kind of scuppered on that approach, so we need something better. There are other methods of inventory control then that are in use. One, of course, would be rating something according to its use. It means looking at the activity. So some inventory is monitored more closely than others. A more common method is to use a perpetual inventory system, which is what we have on computer software, so that the orders are triggered by the levels that you have in inventory, and of course it will automatically relate those to use. A new idea which is coming in is what's called JIT, just in time, which is used by a number of manufacturers and is proving popular in the electronics industry. So, what's the idea of just in time? Well, just in time means let's keep a minimum level of inventory and we'll produce the finished goods at the last moment. It's not suitable for all industries, but it does have its advantages for some industries. What it means is you tie up very little capital. You don't have that much work in progress. You don't have to carry large amounts of inventory. You don't need as much space for storage, material handling falls. A firm like Dell Computers introduced JIT So what they were doing, and still do, is in fact they take online orders and other orders, and as each order comes in, so each computer is configured and built as orders are received, so the customers can have different specifications. We actually give that idea a name. We call it a pull system because the demand for the computers is actually being determined by the orders from the customers. In other words, the production is being pulled through assembly. So what are the risks or disadvantages of using something like JIT just in time? Well, if there's a low inventory, it means high quality is needed. If you don't carry very much inventory and you suddenly find that there's a fault in a component, then you could be stuck waiting for new amounts to come through. So you've got to have high quality. You also need short setup times. So if you've got something with a large setup time, then it's not really suitable. And of course you've got to have low lead-in times for purchasing and reliable suppliers, of course. If you are going to have components that you can get hold of in 2 or 3 days, then obviously if the suppliers suddenly fail you and it takes a week or so, then you could be losing a lot of orders. What JIT just in time does do though is reduce wastage. Whenever you store inventory, it does mean that there are other controls that are needed. And particularly if you've got something like raw material. If you've got large amounts of raw material, you don't store it properly, then it can deteriorate. You also have got higher risks. The larger amount you store, the higher the risk from fire or flood or power outages. And of course the higher the risk of inventory being kept becoming obsolete. So we need to control use. We need regular checks of inventory. We need records kept of any losses, and we need to adjust the inventory accordingly. And we need to review our storage requirements. If you've got something that goes through several stages in production, then obviously you've got inventory out at those various stages, and that means you should also have good quality control as well. You should also review production processes from time to time to make sure you're not actually having a waste of raw material at any point in the sequence. That then ends our podcast on inventory, our introduction to inventory, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors, narrated by David Hopcroft. If you would like to access our playlist so that you've got all your costing podcasts together, then sign up on Moodle for our playlists by visiting parkbenchtutors.com. Thank you for watching and for listening. We wish you success in your studies.